It's so great to see you all again, and welcome back, everyone. In the last session, I hoped to convince you that real giants existed in our past, and possibly still do today. Last week we looked at the way that certain evil groups in our society seem to be rushing to recreate conditions in the world that resemble those that existed shortly before the flood of Noah, including the presence of dinosaurs and sea monsters such as Leviathan, giants and other mutations of the human being, and a ruling class connected to the fallen angels. So in session 28, we're starting on a couple of sessions on giants. This is Giants Part 1. Now, we have a passage in the book of Genesis, and it says the following: The sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they took wives, and they begat giants. Now, the occultists knew Atlantis, the resurrection of the old order, is their dream of the re-persecution of the Atlantean war against heaven, which it thinks that it may now, with modern technology, have a chance of winning. Now, such a victory would also deliver the fallen angels from the great judgment day they are otherwise facing. And this is a biblical and old Jewish theme. Theirs is a Nimrod-like policy of preemptive strike against heaven, which some people believe was also among the intended functions of the original Tower of Babel. The fallen angels clearly need to come up with something if they are to avoid their decreed destruction. Like so many things that were still thought to be utterly mythological only 50 years ago, Atlantis is now thought to have been a real continent and a real society of advanced beings. I doubt, however, that the dates given to this ancient society by New Agers is real, and I believe that Herodotus was actually correct in describing its demise as being 900 years before Plato, and not the 9,000 years preferred by editors, bringing the date of the fall of Atlantis to around about 1600 BC, and to almost the same date as the exodus of Israel from Egypt. I'm sure that Herodotus is factual when he locates Atlantis in the ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the modern Strait of Gibraltar. Nothing can be found there now, not even on the ocean floor, so Atlantis must have been further south, probably approaching South Africa on the western side. Nevertheless, if the original Pillars of Hercules idea is right, that landmass must have suffered, in one blow, a massive displacement toward the South Pole. As it moved, the African landmass felt the pressure and moved east and then west, tearing open the seaway that is now known as the Gulf of Aqaba. This all occurred as the Exodus was underway, and it led to Moses, who was leading the people overland to the mountain of God, encountering a new body of water at the Gulf of Aqaba, forcing him to backtrack to the tip of the Sinai Peninsula. Meanwhile, Atlantis was driven into the original landmass of Antarctica, and its people quickly froze or starved to death. It is possible, many think, that Plato and Herodotus mixed up the destruction of Atlantis with the cataclysmic submergence of Thera, which is in the Mediterranean Ocean, causing many to identify Atlantis as ancient Thera. The destruction of Thera also dates to about the time of the Exodus, and very probably Thera went up volcanically at the same time as Africa did its left-right dance, and the Gulf of Aqaba was formed, and Atlantis ploughed at the same time into Antarctica. Relics found on Thera suggest it may well have had a close trading relationship with the Atlanteans long before the Greeks took it over as their own. However, if Plato's 900 years is an error for 1900 years, one could also posit the explanation that Atlantis fell as a result of Noah's flood, while the destruction at Thera might have taken place as part of those cataclysms connected to the Exodus miracles of 1609 BC, when the Red Sea also parted near the mouth of the newly formed Gulf of Aqaba. But this is forcing the text a bit, and the text as it stands says 900 years, which seems to connect the fall of Thera and the fall of Atlantis to about the same date as the Exodus. Now, to keep continental drift theories on the same timeline as the Bible, and not on the 300 million year timeline of geologists, it's necessary for most of the continental drift seen in the geological record to have taken place in the last 5,000 years, with a particularly large set of movements occurring with the tectonic ruptures associated with the Great Flood, and in the relaxation phase which spanned the centuries just afterwards. The overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah in the 20th century BC and the parting of the Red Sea 4 centuries later took place as the African continent twice lurched around a pivotal point under the Swiss Alps, once westwards and then eastwards, forcing an ocean first into and then out of Israel, a reversing of the Jordan, and a lowering of the Dead Sea plain, as well as the creation of the Gulf of Aqaba. The Earth seems, at the time of Noah's flood, to have suffered a pole deflection of around 50 degrees, and this shifted it from a backwards lean of 20 degrees to a forward tilt of 33 degrees. It also exchanged the spring and the autumn seasons, and it caused Moses to have to reset Israel's season-based calendar to start about 6 months further along in the year. Now, ignoring the miracle in which Joshua has the sun and the moon stand still, which must have had the earth doing a kind of roll to keep the sun from setting, there's also the story of King Hezekiah and his sundial, where the axis moves back another 10 degrees, so that today we have the 23-degree axial inclination. Great monuments all around the world, including Easter Island, Stonehenge, the Giza Pyramids, Machu Picchu, and at least a dozen others, were all found to lie on a circle whose center is in western Alaska, offset from the present axis by about 10 degrees. The background picture there on the screen shows that circle, and the little dots are the famous monuments we find around the world. So those great monuments pertain to a global configuration that existed before Hezekiah's sundial miracle in the 750s BC. Events causing axial displacements like these could certainly also have been accompanied by periods of rapid continental drift, which would have occurred then in the centuries between 500 BC and 2000 BC. All in all then, the idea that Atlantis has been displaced so far southwards by tectonic shifts that it now lies at the South Pole is gaining traction. To agree with Herodotus, many now argue that Atlantis was probably originally alongside Africa and then got moved 3,000 kilometers further south in a huge tectonic event that saw it collide into another landmass that was already at or near the South Pole, and the two island continents then combined to become modern Antarctica. This tectonic movement was so quick, in less than, say, a week, that the inhabitants were probably drowned by floodwaters and then snap frozen under the Antarctic ice. The most probable time for this event would have been the Great Flood, when all the great fountains of the deep were broken open according to Scripture, indicating a great loss of integrity in the mantle. The age of the Atlantean civilization would then be about the same as the age of the Himalayas and the Great Flood, that is, about 4,400 years ago. Huge Coriolis effects in a partially fluid crust could possibly have carried the continent from temperate latitudes to the pole, where it now lies under 2 miles of ice. This was also the year in which the fallen angels were finally incarcerated in the earth. The ruins under the ice in Antarctica are certainly real, and reveal, among other things, a pre-flood society of humans, animals, and 12-foot giants. Identification of part of Antarctica as Atlantis still needs more proof, however, but initial surveys seem to show that the mountains and plains flowing down to the Ron ice shelf fit the description of Atlantis almost exactly. However, what they have discovered there may be of even greater significance than Atlantis, because nearby is Antarctica's tallest mountain, Mount Vinson, and Mount Vinson appears to fit the bill to be that mountain in 1 Enoch 18 that imprisons Eden's fallen angels. To see if this whole story is not just science fiction, we will need to start first with some basic proof that such giants even existed, and that's going to be largely our goal today, and we'll push it forward in the next session. But this proof will at least give some credence to the story that the sons of God, also called the Watchers in the book of Enoch, and loosely referred to as fallen angels by Christian commentators, did indeed exist, and that the story of the imprisoning of these angels for the last 5,000 years is indeed true. If shown to be true, this will naturally prepare us for the rest of the story, which, according to our combined reading of Enoch, Daniel, Matthew, and Revelation, indicates that these angels, and some of their surviving offspring, will be released briefly at the end of this present world age, in fact its last 3.5 years. And they'll be planning to work quickly and to collude with the final great Antichrist to propagate the great lie that Paul warns us about. It seems that we are at the doorstep of that now, and this study of giant remains is probably quite important in the grand scheme of things, as it will help open our minds to things we didn't think were possible about our world or its history. Helping us along a little will be the apparent discovery in the early 1990s of what many believe is the actual skull of Goliath, whom David slew. Although some believe the embedded stone in the forehead to be a hoax, it is certainly a very large, real skull with a crack in the forehead, and a round stone is certainly in line with the biblical account of David having found round stones and slinging it into the head of the giant Goliath. Moreover, the skull was apparently unearthed in the valley of Elah, which is near Jerusalem, and which is where the famous encounter occurred. The find was announced to the media in 1993. People will claim that the head of Goliath was taken to Jerusalem, but I sort of doubt this because, for a start, the body and the head would have decayed and it would not have been pleasant. And I think even if it had been taken to Jerusalem, it may have been taken back afterwards to the valley of Elah for burial. Certainly the armor and the sword of Goliath were kept, because at a later stage David did seize that sword and use it for something when he was running from Saul. Now, although Goliath was a giant of over 9 feet tall, somewhere between 9 and 10 feet, the Palestinian god Baal was said to stand at 12 feet in height. There were certainly some very tall characters around. The tomb of King Arthur, apparently unearthed a couple of years ago at Glastonbury, held the skeleton of a man nearly 10 feet in height. And Salisbury Plain near Stonehenge also holds the remains of giants in its fields. And that YouTube will show you at the end of the session today. A very interesting one it is. The remains of King Gilgamesh of Babylon, famous from the Gilgamesh epic, were found in the excavations at Uruk, Uruk being the ancient name that we today call Iraq. The excavation Uruk in 2003, and those remains were purportedly nearly 16 feet in length. When Cortez and other Spanish explorers landed in Aztec America after 1519, they also stumbled on living giants, according to the Vatican's Codex Vaticanus A. The Dutch and the Portuguese reported giants in Patagonia, and Dutch explorers in the 1700s found 12-foot giants on one side of Easter Island, cohabiting on the island with its natives. And there's still a media buzz about the 15-foot Kandahar giant that the US troops apparently had to kill when it attacked their troops in a very remote desert region in Afghanistan in 2002. These latter references all relate to giants that are still alive in our own times, or otherwise waking up from long periods of sleep or suspended animation in various mountain caverns around the world, where perhaps they managed to escape Noah's flood. And there's a host of YouTube videos currently available about this very topic if you're interested to look it up. Now let's spend some time today to review what was known, or purportedly known, about giants coming into the 20th century, before we start talking about giants that may still be alive today. And this will be mixed in with biblical references to giants. Today will therefore be the first of 5 sessions, in fact, on the topic of giants, Genesis, and genetics. So, giants, what evidence is there? Well, there are actually many reports of giant bones being discovered from pre-Roman days through to the present day. Nowadays we can obtain lasting proof of something we have seen in the form of photographic images and videos. However, today's new problem is photoshopping. We don't know anymore at first glance whether a photograph or image that we have received is real or not. Good ancient historians, old newspaper articles or old already published photographs are in many ways much more reliable now as evidence. Unfortunately, there is a program today of disinformation in which they don't want people to believe these things ever occurred, that the presence of giants is real, because that all tends to support the biblical narrative, and that's not wanted. Now, the Smithsonian Institute, by the way, was started by James Smithson in 1846. Smithson was a 33rd degree Freemason and had bought intellectually into the New World Order of the Illuminati. The Smithsonian Institute is one of those dedicated to the promotion of the theory of evolution, and the presence of giants in history puts a huge spanner in the works for that theory. Many of the giant skeletons the Institute had collected were put consequently onto ships and were disposed of in the ocean. Let me play you a section from a YouTube video where we see a screen capture from an article describing what the Smithsonian Institute has been doing with these precious ancient relics. No, they have not been cataloguing them and arranging them in some sort of museum for display, but have instead been engaging in a campaign of confiscation of evidence.
Well, to tell a family secret, my grandmother was Dutch.
Namaste, sentient being, citizen of Gotham. It is Tuesday, August 25th, 2015. Thank you for stopping by and tuning in. I do appreciate it. Hope all of you are doing well. The sheep no more. Smithsonian admits to destruction of thousands of giant skeletons in the 1900s. A United States Supreme Court ruling has forced the Smithsonian Institute to release classified papers dating from the early 1900s that prove the organization was involved in a major historical cover-up of evidence showing giant human remains in the tens of thousands that had been uncovered all across America and were ordered to be destroyed by high-level administrators to protect the mainstream chronology of human evolution at that time. Well, if you know about Darwinism, which most of us do, Darwinism is the theory that man developed from ape, and of course there has been always a missing link, which they haven't found, but they're trying to say, well, we still evolved from apes, or chimpanzees rather, and that we haven't found the missing link, and they've tried to push it out with Lucy a long time ago, and then they finally admitted that they were putting bones of different animals together to try and create this facsimile. Continuing, the allegations stemming from the American Institution of Alternate Archaeology, AIAA, that the Smithsonian Institute had destroyed thousands of giant human remains during the early 1900s was not taken lightly by the Smithsonian, who responded by suing the organization for defamation, trying to damage the reputation of the 168-year-old institution. Well, obviously, they were trying to do this, and then people talked about it, so they wanted to shut them up, and the best way to shut them up is to sue them, because the Smithsonian obviously has a lot of money. During the court case, new elements were brought to light, and several Smithsonian whistleblower admitted to the existence of documents that allegedly proved proved, the destruction of tens of thousands of human skeletons reaching between 6 feet tall and 12 feet tall in height are really mainstream archaeology cannot admit to different reasons, claims AIAA spokesman James Sherwood, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. There's been a major cover-up by the Western archaeological institutions since the early 1900s to make us believe that America was first colonized by Asian peoples migrating through the Bering Strait 15,000 years ago, but in fact there are hundreds of thousands of burial mounds all over America, which the natives claim were there a long time before them. And that shows traces of highly developed civilizations, complex use of metal alloys, and where giant human skeletons remain are frequently found but still go unreported in the media and news outlets, he explains. The turning point of the court case was when a 1.3 meter long human femur bone was shown as evidence in the court of existence of such giant human bones. The evidence came as a blow to the Smithsonian's lawyers, as the bone had been stolen from the Smithsonian by one of their high-level curators in the mid-1930s who had kept the bone all his life and which had admitted on his deathbed in writing of the undercover operations of the Smithsonian. There's a terrible thing that has been done to the American people, he wrote in a letter. We are hiding the truth about the forefathers of humanity, our ancestors, the giants who roamed the earth, as recalled in the Bible and ancient texts of the world. The United States Supreme Court has since forced the Smithsonian Institute to publicly release classified information about anything related to the destruction of evidence pertaining to the mound builder culture and to elements relative to human skeletons of greater height than usual, a ruling the AIAA is extremely enthused about. And there's the femur bone. You can see the femur's, this guy's probably 5'10" or 6 feet tall, and the thing has got to be at least 4 to 5 feet, at least 4.5 feet long. That's a very long femur bone. The public release of these documents will help archaeologists and historians to reevaluate current theories about human evolution and help us greater our understanding of the mound builder culture in America and around the world, explains AIAA Director Hans Gutenberg. Finally, after a century of lies, the truth about our giant ancestors shall be revealed to the world, he acknowledges, visibly satisfied by the court ruling. The documents are scheduled to be released in 2015, and the operation will be coordinated by an independent scientific organization to assure political neutrality. The evidence supporting documents by Nita Hiltner, the entire conspiracy theory revolving around the existence of American giants or Nephilim lies with the Smithsonian's insistence that no physical specimens of such creatures remain. Those who choose to discredit stories of Nephilim argue that since there's no physical evidence to analyze, giants never existed, but hundreds and perhaps thousands of newspapers accounts from the 19th and early 20th centuries say otherwise. Also, contrary to popular belief, the Smithsonian does in fact have records of abnormally large skeletons on file, but to add more fuel to the fire of those who support the theory of giants, the Smithsonian now claims that the physical remains associated with those official documents have been also lost. Right. PDF can be downloaded from Smithsonian archives in its entirety here, but it's very large, around 900 pages, and the entire document can be downloaded in order to view a few select pages. A much easier way to navigate the file is using Google Books. The particular edition is located on Google Books here. Links directly to page 113 in the text above, for page 362, just to use the function to navigate to this page. Below are just a few of the various newspaper clippings one can expect to encounter when searching online databases such as the Library of Congress. Check out the newspaper clippings below. These are all the newspapers. I assume if you click on it, it will go. It either opens up the picture or goes, yeah, it just opens up the picture. So let's see. Entirety here. Let's see what this should be, the entire PDF. Oh, it's not found, so that link does not work. Unfortunately, let's see if Google Books works. That should work. Yes, it does. Okay, it goes right to 113 that we're talking about, which is cool.
So that was quite interesting, wasn't it? Now here's an example of what I would consider to be a reliable photograph from Italy, which was produced before the days of photoshopping, and it's the kind of thing we're talking about as real proof of the discovery of giant remains. This was a skeleton that was dug up by farmers in Italy, If we look at the size of the head, we can see that it's about, well, I suppose 5 or 6 times as large in terms of height or width as a normal person's head. So that makes a person that would be 5 or 6 times taller, so about 30 feet tall. And it wouldn't be the only one. Here's another list of some of the reports about giant human fossils that have been uncovered. This is a list of far older remains than those listed in our video so far. And this comes from various sources. For instance, a human thigh bone, 8 feet 4 inches long, from Mexico. Now, you know, a thigh bone is only about 2 feet or less in general, so we're talking here about somebody that's 4.5 to 5 times taller than the average human. There were 3 human skeletons unearthed near Palermo in Sicily in 1548 and 1550, measuring 30 feet, 33 feet, and 30 feet. 2 human skeletons were unearthed near Athens in Greece in recent centuries. One was 34 feet long and the other was 36 feet long. We see there's quite a few there in the 30-foot to 40-foot range. That's really, really enormous. A skeleton reported at 29 feet in length was found in 1456 near the Rhone River. A 19-foot 6-inch human skeleton was found in 1577 AD under an overturned oak tree in the canton of Lucerne. A 23-foot tall skeleton was found in 1456 AD beside a river in Valence, France. And a 25-foot 6-inch skeleton was found in 1613 AD near the castle of Chaumont in France, and it was a nearly complete find. Now these, of course, were buried in much earlier times, but not so much more than 2,000 years ago, perhaps. Certainly, I would say they were post-flood. And so these giants were walking around in Europe and along the coasts of Europe particularly, even in the times of, say, Moses and Joshua. And some people believe that it was when Joshua attacked the giants and they fled from Israel that they began to spread through the Mediterranean region. Then there was the unbelievable find of 2 36-foot long human remains, which were uncovered by the Carthaginians somewhere between 200 and 600 BC, and they were so famous that people took tours to see the bones. From Europe, they would go on ships across to the Carthaginian coast just to see these giant remains. And almost every few years now, in excavations in North America, individual giants and even whole communities of giants, we're talking here about 8, 9, 10 feet in height, are being unearthed. By this time, I guess the giants have become smaller, because this goes back perhaps a couple of centuries to when these giants were buried. Now, there are also the Patagonian giants, and many people consider them to be mythical and exaggerations by travelers, but Magellan and others reported that there were giants in Patagonia, and we still see some very tall living descendants in Patagonia. The Dutch explorers Roggeveen and Behrens in 1722 reported white-skinned 12-foot tall living giants called Hanauepe cohabiting with the natives at Easter Island. We have this famous footprint of a woman in South Africa, which is embedded on rock that's now, of course, become hard. It's called the footprint of God in sort of local fame in South Africa. Now, it's the giant footprint of a woman measuring over 4 feet. The foot rather is over 4 feet long, and so the woman herself must have been about 27 feet tall. Now we're going to watch a series of 3 videos now. One is about this footprint. Another is about giant remains where we find giants with double rows of teeth and flattened heads, etc. And then we're going to see a long one. It's an hour and 21 minutes, but it's very, very interesting and very full of information about giants around the world, but it goes into the giants of Stonehenge, King Arthur's tomb, and many other things, so that'll be a great watch. So I'll leave you with those 3 videos now and return just at the end.
We are at the famous site of the giant footprint, or the footprint of God, here near Mphaluzi in South Africa, very close to the Swaziland border. Now this is one of the greatest examples of an ancient footprint, a giant footprint about 4 feet high in rough granite. It's between 200 million and 3 billion years old. That's what geologists will tell you. I'm going to just take you, if you follow me, up to the top where it's imprinted against the side of the rock, which means it's been around for so long that the tectonic plates and the movements have actually pushed it up at the apex of this little outcrop. It's quite spectacular, so just walk with me and I'll show you. I don't know of any other example of a footprint in rock that is as amazing as this. And this should be drawing 20 million tourists to South Africa every year, and nobody knows about it. It's unbelievable. And there we have it. Let's get closer. Oh wow. This is just beautiful. Look at this. There's the, you know, when you, there's the big toe and the other 4 toes down to the small toe, down to the heel. What's fascinating about this is anybody that does a study of this will notice this piece sticking out here. It's like when you put your foot in mud and you pull it out, your toes will lift up a little mud where your toes were, and that's exactly what seems to have happened here. This rough granite is just, it's pulled up this overhang here. It's spectacular. And I see that people have been visiting here because they've been leaving little coins here, which is wonderful. Maybe just come closer and show this from more close up. Okay, well, I don't know who else has filmed this, but I think we'll put this up for everybody to see, for everyone to really appreciate this. Is a spectacular bit of human history. There were giants on Earth.
The Cherokee called them the Moon People. The Utes and Paiutes spoke of a hideous race of cannibals 10 feet tall living in caves. And the Choctaw also have an account of the race of giants that first colonized the Ohio Valley. From Old World Roots of the Cherokee, Chapter 5, America's Middle Ages, pages 78 to 79, we read. What kind of Indians lived in the territory the Choctaw and Chickasaw carved out for their new home? According to their traditions, reports Cushman, as confirmed by excavations of bones in Tennessee, it was a race of white giants. Tee tradition of the Choctaws told of a race of giants that once inhabited the now state of Tennessee, and with whom their ancestors fought when they arrived in Mississippi in their migration from the west, doubtless Old Mexico. Their tradition states the Nolo, race of giants, literally, wizards, was of wonderful stature, but, as their tradition of the mastodon, which used to be found on the Great Plains, so this was also considered to be but a foolish fable, the creature of a wild imagination, when lo! Their exhumed bones again prove the truth of the Choctaws' tradition. 151. These giants could have been refined Esxatlans. Cushman then recounts the discovery in 1880 at a burial mound site near Plano, Texas, of human bones of enormous size. The femoral bones being 5 inches longer than the ordinary length, and the jaw bones so large as to slip over the face of a man with ease. Cushman goes on to identify them with the older occupants of North America called Allegheny or Talagewi, Taugans. Many historians, moreover, speculate they were the builders of the Adena mounds. As for the Chickasaw, Cushman notes that they have no record of their history before the colonial period, although it is assuredly the same as the Choctaws, being one tribe and people until the division made by their 2 chiefs Chickasaw and Chatta many years after their arrival and location east of the Mississippi River, p. 358. Of the Natchez, Cushman records that they, if tradition may be believed, also came from Mexico where they had lived for centuries, p. 440. A story was told by the Comanches in 1857. Innumerable moons ago, a race of white men, 10 feet high, and far more rich and powerful than any white people now living, here inhabited a large range of country, extending from the rising to the setting sun. Their fortifications crowned the summits of the mountains, protecting their populous cities situated in the intervening valleys. They excelled every other nation which was flourished, either before or since, in all manner of cunning handicraft, were brave and warlike, ruling over the land they had wrested from its ancient possessors with a high and haughty hand. Compared with them the palefaces of the present day were pygmies, in both art and arms. They drove the Indians from their homes, putting them to the sword, and occupying the valleys in which their fathers had dwelt before them since the world began. At length, in the height of their power and glory, when they remembered justice and mercy no more and became proud and lifted up, the Great Spirit descended from above, sweeping them with fire and deluge from the face of the earth. The mounds we, that is the speaker chief Rolling Thunder and his Spanish listener, had seen on the tablelands were the remnants of their fortresses, and the crumbling ruins that surrounded us all that remained of a mighty city. The word Nahulo or Nello is now emphatically applied to the white race and no other. The Nello were of white complexion, according to Choctaw tradition, and were still an existing people at the time of the advent of the Choctaws to Mississippi, concludes Cushman, p. 153. In agreement, the Indian trader Adair often refers to the Nani-Ishtahulo as departed white ghosts vested with spiritual powers whose descendants were priests and magicians. Their cries and magic spells could still be heard in the mounds like those at Okmulgee. 2. These references contribute to the suspicion that the Indians who preceded Asiatic tribes from Mexico were, as we would say today, Caucasian. About exactly a year ago on this blog, we published a post about Neanderthals in America, mentioning also the peculiar archaic skeleton that is now a roadside attraction in Arizona, called the Thing. In the meantime, we acquired a copy of Fritz Zimmermann's book, The Nephilim Chronicles, which reproduces over 300 historical accounts of giant skeletons. Many are associated with the earliest mound sites in America, but Zimmermann's survey of this worldwide phenomenon ranges from the hunter-fisher people of Northeast Europe and red paint people whose movements were circumpolar to the giants of the Bible, noted by the Babylonian Talmud as having double rows of teeth, and giants' remains in the British Isles, pages 157-65. Navajo legends speak of the Starnik people, a regal race of white giants endowed with mining technology who dominated the West, enslaved lesser tribes and had strongholds all through the Americas. They were either extinguished or went back to the heavens. The name may be a corruption of the biblical race known as Anakim, Num. 1333, Dut. 128. The name Og, Hebrew chief, appears to be characteristic. See Zimmermann, pages 188-91. The Ogham alphabet is attributed to this cultural founder. Certainly, many of the mound sites uncovered in the 19th century tell a story of constant warfare by incoming Asiatic tribes against the giants occupying the land. One grisly scene showed thousands of skeletons, male, female and young, heaped in a mass grave, with warriors' skulls pierced by arrows. It would appear that as these aboriginal inhabitants of the Ohio Valley were gradually displaced, some members of their society went over into the ranks of the new conquerors, bequeathing a strain of great stature still noticeable, for instance, in the Mobilian chief Tuscaloosa and DeSoto's Indian queen Cofetachiqui, both of whom were said to be 7 feet tall. We are struck by the following traits of this giant race or ethnic group from human prehistory. Mother goddess religion. Copper, not bronze, axes. Polished slate tools including fishing plummets, which were apparently regarded as sacred. Belief that the grandmother moon was the repository of souls. Diet emphasizing shellfish, for which the double row of teeth probably was selected as an evolutionary advantage in their beachcomber origin out of Africa? Building of fish weirs in North American rivers to trap migrating eels. Certain vegetarian habits, wild rice, for instance. Inscriptions on artifacts, especially pipes, often buried with the dead. Use of coal and petroleum. Weaving and looms. Knowledge of seafaring, mathematics and engineering, including canals and irrigation. Burying of a dog with a child to guard the latter in the afterlife. A language apparently Afro-Asiatic and close to Semitic tongues. Kingcraft, nobles were buried in seated positions on thrones surrounded by a coterie of their retainers. When Denisovan man was first discovered, we had just a finger bone to go on. We can only extrapolate the look of the skull. Geneticists conjecture, however, that it was an Austronesian type. We suggest that a modern prize of science will belong to the geneticist who can derive ancient DNA to study and classify from the bones of giant hominids that are unavoidably plentiful in the archaeological and mythological records of humankind. Maybe the owner of the thing will allow researchers to borrow one of the femurs for laboratory analysis and measurement. If that's not possible, the Smithsonian, Carnegie Institute and dozens of local historical societies throughout the Midwest have basements and storage facilities brimming with these relics of American history.
In his talk today, Hugh will focus on giants in the historical record and on the suppression of evidence by the powers that be, including the Smithsonian Institute. Please give Hugh a big, hearty, warm Nexus Conference welcome. I want him to hear it all the way in Glastonbury. Thanks, Hugh.
Thanks, Duncan. Appreciate it. And here's my friend Frank. I just want to introduce him as well. Here's our giant skull. Just thought I'd say hello. So giants. This is one of those very strange subjects. I'll just put Frank down. Something I've been interested in since looking and researching megalithic sites all around the planet. Next, please. And so I've been researching earth grids, megalithic sites, giants. There's so many things to get into once you start becoming a megalithomaniac. I was over in Australia in 2014. I did some research there with Stephen Evan Strong and my friend Stuart Mason, who's an archaeoastronomer, and we were looking at sites. I also went to Tonga as well, and there's been giant accounts on that island as well. Next, please. One of the shows I've been involved with is called Search for the Lost Giants. Now, this is something that my friend, my now co-author, Jim Vieira, manifested on the History Channel. We were researching our book, Giants on Record, and the History Channel approached Jim and said, look, we should do a show about this. It's a strange subject. It's an unusual thing to do, searching for giants in North America in the ancient mounds and buried deep under the ground. It was a sort of underground success. We had like 1 million views per episode, and I think you can catch it online on various websites. So I do recommend you take a look if you're interested in the North American giants, which is something we're going to be focusing on today. We do have a few clips for you as well during the lecture from the show, which point out some very important aspects of this whole very strange giant phenomenon. Next, please. One of the big problems you'll find around the world, all over the internet, are images that have been created in Photoshop. Can you press next, please? And unfortunately, most of these are not real. All the ones you can see on the screen now are famous photographs. You find them in books now, in magazines, all over the internet, even in some semi-academic articles claiming these are real. Just people who haven't done their research, basically. So this is one of the big problems we've faced. The images you can see here actually come from a Photoshop competition on the worth1000.com website from 2002. And it was actually an archaeological competition who could create the best giant in Photoshop. So we have professionals doing it and putting them out on the internet. So this has become one of the banes of the giant researcher, or the giantologists, as we started to call ourselves, sort of tongue-in-cheek recently. But all around the world, we have legends. Next, please. Of these giant skeletons and giant myths. In England, we have many different stories, but the Bible is probably the most amazing place where you find these accounts. You have, obviously, here we have Goliath being defeated by David. We have King Og's bed on the right. We've done some research into the Bible lands, and indeed there are giant skeletons that have been found there, but there are literally over 100 accounts, matter of fact, explanations of the Amorites, the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Canaanites, all being actual live giants in biblical times, going back 2,000 to 4,000 years. Next, please. In England, we have the wonderful stories of Jack the Giant Killer, or Jack and the Beanstalk, which is a later story adapted from Jack the Giant Killer. And you may have seen the movie. That's basically been adapted and included Jack and the Beanstalk in it. The original stories of Jack the Giant Killer were quite violent and bloodthirsty. And people don't realize this, but these go way back. These go back potentially thousands and thousands of years. And even the founding of Britain by Brutus, who came over from Troy, he met a giant on the south coast called Gog Magog and had to battle with him to the death, and threw him off the coast into the sea. And these were the last remnants of the giants of Britain were destroyed by Brutus and his army. And so even in Britain, the founding of this country is based upon giants. And so this is kind of one of the remarkable things we find in many countries: the foundation myths, the early stories, the oral history, the native folklore, the Aboriginal folklore, of course. We find these stories literally all over the world. Next. All across Europe, we found actual accounts of skeletons and bones. And if you look on this map here, this just shows you some examples. Obviously, we've got more in Britain than we have in the rest of Europe, but you can see that they're evenly spaced. They're all over the place. They're not just in one area. And the general rule of giantology is that we're looking for anything over 7 foot tall. That is what we class as a giant. It's not really a huge giant, but this is what we've found. If you actually met a 7 foot tall person and stood next to them, they would appear a giant, even if you're 6 foot tall. But we've found accounts in North America that go double that size, and we've got reports throughout Europe and even near where I am in the southwest of England that reach 13 feet tall, some even 14 feet. So it gets a bit crazy the more you look into this. Next, please. This is my hometown area. I grew up in a town called Cambridge, which is the famous university town in England. A place called the War Ditches, which is just up on the, funnily enough, the Gog Magog Hills. We find that there's actual legends and stories of giants that used to live within the hills. There's the Giant's Grave, which is a natural spring, which is just down from the hills. I used to walk this route every day to school, literally every day. The pub, the public house, the ale house is called Robin Hood and Little John. Little John was Robin Hood's giant sidekick. And so we have all these giant references, even in my hometown of Cambridge, just southeast of Cambridge, in fact, in a village called Cherry Hinton. And then in the 1800s, in 1854, a discreet article in a local newspaper actually reported on giant skeletons being found on the hills. And so, and I quote, "Remains of men who reached to a greater height than ordinary men in the present day were found up there." There were 9 skeletons, and 3 of those were remarkably large. Next. Even at Stonehenge, the original name of Stonehenge is called the Giant's Dance. It's not Stonehenge, that's a later Saxon name. And the image you're seeing here is the earliest depiction of Stonehenge. This goes back to at least, originally it was illustrated in the 1100s, but it wasn't really published until later. It was in private kind of hands. In about the 1300s it was published. And this was based on the history of the kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, and this is an illustration by a gentleman called Wace. And you can see here on the right is the giant. He's lifting the lintel into place. Most books and internet sites claim that that is actually Merlin lifting the stone, but it's not. because Merlin is known to have employed the giants to build these particular sites, especially Stonehenge. And he's actually the one on the bottom left there, instructing the giant what to do. According to Geoffrey of Monmouth, the rocks of Stonehenge were healing rocks, and giants brought them from Africa to Ireland, a place called Killaroos, where they constructed the giant's dance. Later on, when Aurelius Ambrosius, who was an ancient king of the Britons, he sent Merlin to retrieve the rocks, battle with the Irish, and giants brought them over to England and constructed Stonehenge in honour of this great king. And this is where the name the Giant's Dance came from, the fact that Merlin was involved in this. So we've got some very interesting stories about movements of stones. There's even some stories, some of the early accounts say he levitated and effortlessly moved the stones from one area to another. And we know Merlin was a wizard, of course. He's got many different aspects to his skills and personality. But what's interesting is that an area in South Wales, which used to be part of Ireland, strangely, called the Preseli Mountains, is where some of the stones actually came from in Stonehenge and in the surrounding landscape around Stonehenge. And so there could be a suggestion that so-called Merlin or someone with his powers moved them from that area, and it wasn't in fact Ireland. Next, please. So we do actually have accounts. I mean, this isn't an actual photo or anything like that, but this is actually an account here. I haven't found the original source of this, but my good friend and colleague Maria Wheatley told me this was a valid account. A huge skull was stated to exist in a local church. Over 100 years ago, it was reported, and it was sitting in the front entrance of the church for many, many years. And it was noted by famous antiquarian John Aubrey, and it would have belonged to someone 8 to 9 feet tall. And so this is just one example of some of the actual giants fitting in with the legends around Stonehenge. Next. This is just down the road from Stonehenge. This is from 1830 originally, but it was originally reported in 1719. This is, 10 miles from Stonehenge. This is within the Stonehenge landscape. And I actually visited this site yesterday to go and see if there was anything left there. And there was a giant's grave mound, which is what many of the mounds are called in Britain, and often megalithic sites as well are called giant's graves. And in fact, a 9'4" skeleton was discovered there in the vicinity of Stonehenge. And so not many people realise this, that many of these megalithic sites, these famous sites we have in Britain and around the world, often have giant skeletons found nearby. But this is part of the great cover-up that we'll get into later. Next. We even have this. This was another one found near Salisbury by Sir Thomas Elliot. Recorded at some place near Salisbury, a skeleton which measured 14 feet 10 inches in length. So that's nearly 15 feet. This is outrageously tall. If this is for real, I would like to see this skeleton. This would be utterly mind-blowing. But this is what we're researching now. Jim Vieira and I are working on our next book called The Giants of Stonehenge and Ancient Britain. And what we've come up with so far is quite remarkable. It almost matches what we found in North America. Next. This is another mound in the Stonehenge landscape, reported in 1813. Not much information apart from a skeleton of large dimensions was found in a remarkable barrow. Which one that is, we don't know, but I've been working with a local researcher called Simon Banton, and we think we know which mound it is, so we're going to dig into the records here and see if we can actually find the actual skeleton itself. Next. Again, we have a 7-foot skeleton unearthed near Stonehenge, 1825. Next. And Glastonbury, where I've been living for a very long time. Actually, I've just very recently, I didn't tell Duncan this, I've very recently moved to near Stonehenge. I'm living right next to Stonehenge now. I can't keep away from those stones and giants, apparently. But this is very interesting because even Glastonbury, the founding of Glastonbury, has a giant story associated with it. And this absolutely blew my mind. The famous King Arthur's grave in Guinevere was supposed to have been found within Glastonbury Abbey in the 1100s. There was a dream by one of the people, one of the monks at Glastonbury Abbey, that there were some pyramids under the ground, and in between these pyramids was the grave of King Arthur. So they did this whole thing, and they dug down there. This is back over 1,000 years ago. or nearly 1,000 years ago. They unearthed a massive oak trunk buried 16 feet, and also they discovered a human skeleton, which was of massive proportions, and the space between the eye sockets was as wide as the palm of a man's hand. And so this is incredibly large. It was inside an oak coffin, which is a classic kind of ancient Celtic burial tradition, and a standard-sized female skeleton was found there as well. But just above that, a few feet above that, when they were digging, they found this lead cross, which basically translates as, "Here lies interred the famous King Arthur on the Isle of Avalon." Next. However, the problem with this is that they think that could be a fake. But I found, through my research and Jim research as well, we found evidence that indeed the original discovery did describe an over 9 foot tall giant in Glastonbury. Even weirder, it gets very weird. There's a recent program on a famous TV channel in Britain just a few weeks ago, which my friend Thomas Sheridan managed to record a clip of. And this blew my mind. This is like, this is further up north in England, but I'd just like to show you this clip. So next, please. And then I'll discuss it right afterwards.
It's a very highly selected population. They've been reburied here around somebody.
Martin has built up a picture of what happened here from a 17th century account by a gardener who disturbed the burial.
He found the skeleton of a humane man 9 feet long.
Wow.
And around that, there were the bodies of 100 others with their feet pointing towards the central grave.
Martin thinks the giant was a war leader.
We think it's the burial of Ivar Bainlösi.
So this is Ivar the Boneless, who is one of the most famous Viking commanders who ever
and
came.
one of the leaders of the great army that arrived in Essex in 865, and which was here in the winter of 873-4, after 10 years of campaigning, for the last time.
By a gardener who disturbed the burial.
He found the skeleton of a humane man 9 feet long. Humane man 9 feet long.
Wow.
And around that,
Thanks. So I hope that clip gave you some indication of kind of what we're dealing with. And this was, I don't know how legal it is, but this was on the BBC. This was on a major BBC historical documentary, and somehow it got through and got broadcast. And so this absolutely stunned me. And I'm going to be going up north, and I'm going to be researching this over this summer. This summer is like my research summer for the next book. We're going to go, me and my girlfriend are going to go around Britain and have a good look around and see if we can actually find any bones on display. But this map here we've got, this just shows you Europe again, and shows you the spread. We're going to jump over to Ireland for a little while. So next, please. And this is one example here in the Boyne Valley area of Newgrange and Knowth and Douth. We also have a site called Fornox, and this is a very famous site, which is a beautiful mound site. Inside it is this incredible chamber with these beautiful zigzag carvings and spiral carvings. And on December the 11th, 1950, in the Island Sentinel, huge skeletons were said to have been found, which absolutely stunned the people involved in this. There were 2 or 3 newspaper reports. It caused a bit of a sensation, and it just suggests that the original builders of the megalithic sites in Ireland could well have been giants. Next. This is the famous giant from Ireland, which was almost mummified. It was discovered in a peat bog in County Antrim, and it was said to be 12 foot 2 inches tall, and the girth of the chest was 6 foot 6 inches. The length of one arm was 4 foot 6 inches. It actually got driven around as on display in Dublin, Liverpool, and Manchester. What happened to it at the end, though, we don't know. Some guy didn't pay his bill or his train fare or something, and it disappeared, and no one knows what happened to it. And interestingly, you can see it covered up its private parts. And the reason they did that is because many of the Victorian women kept fainting with what they saw there, so they had to cover it up. So you can imagine the fright it would have been for Victorian women witnessing something like that. Further accounts in Ireland. Next, please. This shows you one from Dysart in Louth. This is really a skull, which is 18 inches from the crown to the chin. And this is similar to Frank here. This is similar to like Frank's size. You can see the size of his skull next to mine. It's pretty big. And they claimed it must have been from a person who originally stood 10 feet tall. So I'm just going to whip through some more countries around Europe now and going into the Middle East. Let's go next, please, and let's go have a look at the area on the southern part of this map in Egypt. Next, this is an area called Philae Island, the Temple of Isis, nothing to do with the terrorist or anything. And this was a discovery in 1881. 16 miles below Najjar Dafad, a row of tombs and a remarkable prehistoric race of giants were uncovered. Some measure 7 feet and 8 inches in length, and the largest 11 feet 1 inch. Now, this was a matter-of-fact account. This was part of an archaeological dig, one of the earlier more like an antiquarian dig, in 1881 by Professor Timmerman. So this is utterly mind-blowing. Could this be for real? It could well be. Next, because further north of there, just north of Cairo towards the area of Alexandria, this was found. This is a very, very strange thing. You may have seen this already. This has been all over the internet by a researcher called Gregor Spory. He presented a number of photos a few years ago, and you had to pay a few $100 to see this. But this was in a private collection of a former, very old grave robber or tomb raider, if you like. And this was X-rayed, it was scanned, this was a real finger, this was from a mummified person, and either this person had extremely large hands and was a freak, or he was actually a giant, and he would have stood something like 15 to 16 feet tall. Next. If we just head further around the Middle East area, go slightly northeast, here we get into the biblical references. And this gets crazy when you start looking into this. I mean, I'm not going to go through all these, but these are just some examples of what we find in the Bible. We have the classic stories of the Watchers and human women mating and creating the Nephilim, and these terrorized people. They became cannibals, which is something we also find in North America still in some of the accounts we've got in the book. We have the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Rephaim, and many others. Here's just some examples. Next. Even in Italy, I mean, I'm just going through some countries here. I was going to give you some accounts just to sort of blow your mind with this is a genuine worldwide phenomenon. Next. There's just one example here. This is a woman 7 foot tall was found on the left there. And also on the right near Turin, Italy, 7 skeletons were discovered over 7 foot tall. Next. This is from 1838 in Gigenti, which is a kind of reference to giants, the name itself. And this was reported originally in 1807 when they dug down into this cavern and found a skeleton of an extremely tall giant, said to be 11 feet 4 inches in length. However, this was Italian measure, not English measure. The English measure would have been 10 foot 5 feet, just to clear that up. Next, and this just shows you a close-up of the original illustration. They also found hieroglyphics there carved on these stones, and if you look, a kind of cleanly put together wall. Because all over this part of Italy, all along the west coast, we have very powerful megalithic sites, these polygonal walls, perfectly cut, just like you find in Peru. So this is said to have been built by the early giants. Next. This is from a place called Castelnau in France. From 1892. This was the original report. This came out on October the 3rd of that year. But previously, this had been noted by researchers there in 1890. Bones of enormous size, double the ordinary, in fact, were found in the tumulus of Castelnau. They've been examined by Professor Keener. Very tall race, nevertheless finds the abnormality in dimensions and of morbid growth. If we actually look at the bones, and they've been measured, they've been analysed by various professors, it would have been 3.5 metres tall, which is 11 foot 6 inches. Now this, we're finding sort of very high range of giants here. This is the higher range of what we're dealing with in our research. She's almost twice the height of me. And they tested several of the bones from the skeleton. All of them are of that size. So next, please. This just shows you the sheer size of what we're dealing with here. And this further research has been done by a gentleman, a good friend of ours called Micah Ewers, who lives on the west coast of America. And he's been analysing this, and he believes this is a genuine account. And we know one of the bones is on display in France. We're going to try and investigate that this summer. Next, this just shows you the bone. And the size of it compared to a normal femur or thigh bone. Next. And just to put it in context, there's many other accounts in France. Here's just a few examples. There's too many to mention here. If the one at the bottom in the middle there is 10 and 15 feet in height, so we're looking at extremely tall skeletons. On the right, 7-foot skeletons were found, and so on and so forth. Next. We have Tenerife. This is an island where some very interesting volcanic stone pyramids have been found. But this is actually the work of Thor Heyerdahl. He actually did some research here. And these are the so-called Guanches, and these are supposed to be giants. And there's been some recent research done on one of the mummies found there, who was oversized, which just came out a few weeks ago. I haven't found a good photo of that yet, because I think the one I saw was photoshopped and exaggerated somewhat. But there's a 14-foot high skeleton and 80 teeth in the mouth, which would suggest he had double rows of teeth, a phenomenon we'll be discussing very soon. Next. Even in Turkey, not too far from this polygonal wall site, again, like we find in Italy, we find in Peru, we find in Egypt, a 7-foot skeleton was found, and he was the bodyguard of an ancient Hittite princess. Next. Sardinia, there's multiple accounts of giants here. All the sites there are said to be built by giants. There's been bones, skeletons found. The account we've got here on the right is one that was 8 feet tall. We're going to be going here this summer, me and my girlfriend. We're going to go and check this out. I'm obsessed by this place. I still haven't been there yet. My good friend James Swagger and Maria Wheatley have been doing some research over there, so hopefully we're going to get there, see if we can find some bones. Next. Even if we jump over to Japan, we find, again, more polygonal walls. We find dolmens, and again, we find giants. There's a connection here, clearly. Perfect teeth, and this is something we find in the North American giants. And again, 7-foot high giants have been found. Next. Now whoever made this footprint is obviously larger than 7 foot tall. And this is almost 4 to 5 feet long. And this is on the South Africa. It's my good friend Michael Tellinger, which I think has been over to the Nexus conference. And myself, we visited there a couple of years ago. And I could not believe what we saw there. Geologists claim it's natural. It just doesn't look natural. It looks strangely real, because you even have the bit on the toe overlap thing. So when your foot goes in, you pull it out of mud, you have this overlap, it happens, and this is actually what's in this. And that's granite, so technically that can't happen, but it's worth noting as an anomaly. Next. And here we find, even in near Johannesburg, a 10-foot tall giant was discovered, not far from the area, so yet more examples to deal with. Next. Even if we jump over to Peru, skeleton of a human who must have been 8 feet tall. This is in the Amazon area of Peru. Next. More examples here, this time living giants in the jungle back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That's said to be red-haired and hunchbacks. So what has been going on in the Amazon, we don't know, but there are many, many accounts, legends, and stories of giants. Next. And of course, we have the legends of Tiwanaku, where the great god Viracocha was said to have employed or created giants out of the mud, out of the stone, to build Tiwanaku and all the megalithic sites along the great path of Viracocha. But then they got out of hand, they became cannibals, they terrorized people, and he had to create a flood to destroy them. And this is almost the exact same story we find in the Bible with the Nephilim. And so the connections here utterly astonish me. Next. Excuse me. So even in Australia, we have very, very interesting examples here. This isn't an actual giant. This is a landscape giant, which was actually a piece of art, but I thought it was a nice picture to show. Next. Here's a couple of accounts Jim and I pulled out of the archives just recently, just for this lecture. This is from the 30th of January 1926. Excuse me. Now, this is a giant 7 feet in high, was said to have been discovered in Tasmania. Next. This is very badly, it's not a good quality photo, but this is from 1929 and 1931 it was also reported. For apparently this 7-foot giant found in Port Broughton or Broughton, ended up in the Adelaide Museum. So if anyone's out there from Adelaide, please go and look and ask them in the museum and get back to me. And if you find a giant bone or skeleton, let me know. I'd really appreciate that, because I can't get over there myself, unfortunately, for a little while. But we might be doing some research with Duncan in the near future, so who knows. This is obviously the famous and wonderful Rex Gilroy, showing some massive tools here. I was in touch with him when I was over there last time. I didn't get a chance to meet him. And I mentioned my research and he was kind of intrigued, but this is just some of the massive tools that have been found over there that were discovered or at least collected by Rex Gilroy. Next. This is a so-called fossilized tooth, apparently found in the Winburdale River near Bathurst again, which is where many of them tools were found, which would have been of a gentleman between 10 to 12 feet tall. Next. And further accounts from Bathurst with Rex Gilroy, more huge teeth, and even and other parts of the body really were found. But this one, he claims, would have been a person over 25 feet tall. So this is probably the record of what we've got so far, if this is genuine. Next. Even at the Gympie area, I visited here to look at the so-called Gympie Pyramid up in Queensland. The farmer there, Keith Walker, he said he's found a large back portion of a jaw, which would have been of a gentleman or lady standing 10 feet tall. So again, more circumstantial evidence in Australia. And then we have this very interesting skull from Cow Swamp Skull from Victoria. Now, there were more than one of these, there were several. This is just one that caught my attention because it's got the same archaic features. It's got the brow ridge, it's got the powerful jaw and the high cheekbones, as well as the elongated head. And this is supposed to be 13,000 years old, and it's claimed that, even in the original archaeological report, that it was a man about 40 years old and of large, powerful build, very thick cranial bones, and is one of many that were found in that area, suggesting oversized human beings with very different features were living in that area. Next. So this is the Megalong Valley in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales. You may have heard of this already. Again, this is from Rex Gilroy. I think someone else discovered it and told him about it. 7 inches across at the toes, 2 feet in length. Again, if this is a human and not a Yowie or a Bigfoot, this would have been someone who would have been roughly 12 feet tall, or even 20 feet tall, because other footprints have been found that suggest one's that big. Next. More footprints. Just going to whip through these quickly, then we're going to move to different parts of the world and over to America. So Mulgoa, south of Penrith in New South Wales. Again, more 2 foot long and 7 inches across the toes. Some were found in red sandstone beds. I noticed that the owner must have been 17 feet tall. Again, we're looking at circumstantial evidence here, but the skulls we saw in the previous slides do suggest there's something going on here, and especially as what Duncan was saying earlier, where the Aborigines or Aborigines were, telling the stories about these tribes of giants that were the very early inhabitants of Australia. Next, if we jump over to New Zealand and Kiribati, we do find there's many accounts of giants actually in New Zealand. I'm not going to get into those now because I want to focus on my research. We haven't researched properly there yet. But some 6-toed giants have been found in these particular areas, which are much larger than what they should be. And so the fact that 6 toes have been found on these giants is one of the genetic traits we find in North America, and we also find in the Bible. Next. And this just shows you, this is from Samuel 21, is still another battle which took place at Gath. There was a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He was descended from Rapha. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan, son of Shimei, David's brother, killed him. So there you go. The giants were getting killed off. We have the evidence. Next. And also, in Namadol, we find some very interesting ruins up there. We featured this on part 4 of the Search for the Lost Giants TV show in episode 4. And Namadol was said to be constructed by the twin giant sorcerers, who were said to have built the site using levitation and their immense strength. And they were said to have existed some island in the Pacific, maybe Lemuria or Mu. And there were several historical accounts of giant skeletons being found. One of these is from the American Geographical Society in 1859. And I'll just read some of this to you because this is very, very interesting. A narrow entrance has been opened at the top, through which we descended and found ourselves in a dark cell 8 feet deep, 11 feet by 10 feet in length. The foreigners told us that the coral stones once formed the pavement on the floor of the vault, but within 10 or 15 years they've been torn up by visitors searching for relics. But in 1838, Captain Chaz, a coffin was found, and it took several people to uncover gigantic bones of human bones found within this site. Now this got interesting because Jim's actual neighbour next is this guy called Al, and he actually featured on the show and discussed some legends and stories and even some eyewitness accounts of people who saw the bones on the island. And I'm just going to show you a very short clip from the video with Jim Vieira talking to Al about the world. Next. So now we move to the southern tip of South America before we head into the America itself. This is a very, very interesting story with Patagonia. It's very strange. There have been many accounts, many live giants have been reported there from the 1500s onwards. Ferdinand Magellan, even Sir Francis Drake, and various other, Antonio Pigafetti, various voyagers. Magellan's voyage, one of them, for example, wrote about this. And he quotes saying, "When he was before us, he began to marvel at us, to be afraid. And he raised one finger upwards, believing that we came from heaven. And he was so tall that the tallest of us only came up to his waist." This is just one example, and you can see that in the photos here. There are other accounts of 10-foot skeletons being discovered, but even the women were very tall as well. And even in the next slide, we can see other examples that were actually photographed in the early 1900s. Now, these were slightly further south. If you look on the map on the right, you can see Patagonia and the Antarctic continent itself. All these islands in between were where giants have lived. And these are photographs taken by Captain Cook in the early 1900s of actual giants, and these were at least 7 foot tall, the shorter of what we find over there. So the fact is, they may still exist down there in the Patagonian mountains. We really don't know, but it became like a sensation. A whole there was a giant frenzy throughout Europe at that time. People became really excited by it. More travelers would go down there and try and find them. They even tried to kidnap some of them and bring them back on their boat. And they did this. They actually kidnapped 2 of them or tricked them. They came on the boat, but then they died of either seasickness or they didn't have the right food. Why they didn't keep the skeletons, I don't know, but probably the rotting flesh of 2 giant human beings was enough to put them off before they throw them overboard before they got back to Britain. But anyway, so we do find examples in that part of the world, which is something I'm desperate to investigate myself. Next. So now we're going to move over to North America. Now we're not just going to look at 10 accounts. This is an article Jim and I did for ancient-origins.net, where we were asked to put together an article of 10 of the most important, largest, going from 7 foot up to 18 foot tall, that were found in North America. And I just wanted to show you this because it gives you a kind of a map, really, of what we're dealing with here in our research. But what's most interesting is, next please, is the fact that over 1,000 accounts have been found. We found ourselves in North America. Jim's been doing most of the research on this. He's been going through all the records. We work with a brilliant researcher called Ross Hamilton, who wrote the classic book, A Tradition of Giants. But we just got to a point where once we'd reached 1,000 accounts of giants from newspapers, from town and county histories, from personal diaries of doctors and surgeons, even from the Smithsonian annual reports themselves. This is like the National Museum here. We kind of took notice there's something going on here. And when we started matching it with the legends, with the eyewitness accounts, and what was on display before 1990, before the NAGPRA Act, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, was enforced, we knew there was a real phenomenon here, and we knew the legend. It wasn't just legends; it was an actual phenomenon. Next, this is a map put together by a brilliant researcher called Celia Hall. She's a good friend of ours. She helped us put these maps all around the world together. And we decided to show you this one. This isn't the latest one. This is the early one of about just a few hundred accounts, because the one with 1,000 accounts on it, you can't see America. It becomes a blur. And so we thought we'd better show you this. But this just gives you an example of the location of them. And you can see the real hub is right in the Ohio spot there. You see that? It just gets crazy. It turns into like shadows there. And that's like the sort of giant center. That's like the giantology central. That's where we believe it was the origin point, or the real kind of where the real breeding program really happened. And that's where the hub is. And this just shows you, but almost every state, apart from this strip down in the sort of plains area, on the slightly to the left of the middle in the map, we find giants. Every state we found examples, even on the California Channel Islands off the coast, even off the islands like Martha's Vineyard off the New England coast, right down into Florida, even into the Bahamas, into Mexico, into Canada, everywhere. But this is the giant central. Next. And it's interesting because if we jump back to the story of Geoffrey of Monmouth from the History of the Kings of Britain in 1150 AD, he says something quite kind of charming and interesting, which made me think he was talking about America. Now, it could be speculation, could be like me wanting it to fit, but I'll read this to you anyway. But beyond the realms of Gaul, beneath the sunset, lieth an island, girt about by ocean, guarded by ocean, erst the haunt of giants. Now, was he talking about Ireland, or was he talking about America? Who knows? Next. Now, this is a picture of Sir Francis Drake in 1578, and he made contact with the Patagonians and the Taluchi tribe at the very south tip, as we saw already, in Patagonia. But in his book, which was put together by his nephew, in The World Encompassed, which came out in 1628, next, he found that not only were the Patagonian giants quite remarkable. This just shows you his voyage. I don't know if you can see this here. He comes over from England, goes around the southern tip of the Americas, and back up the coast all the way to North America and around the world. He did the whole circumnavigation of the globe. But he actually met some of these giants in Patagonia. But most interestingly, next, he also met some in North America. When he was up, he pulled into San Francisco Bay, or near there. We're not sure exactly where it was from his description. I didn't have a name then. And he met a tribe up there who were quite a disorganized tribe, but some of the chiefs were extremely tall. And this kind of intrigued him. They had to fix their boats. They had to spend a few months there in the summer of that year. And they tried to get him to become king because they were so disorganized, and he was such a gentleman and organized. But he kind of refused, but went along with it in a way. But he describes them as being over 7 foot tall and powerful human beings. So we have Sir Francis Drake talking about them from Patagonia and up in San Francisco, which is fascinating because no one mentions that. You talk to anyone about Sir Francis Drake, nothing. Okay, so this is just one of the little things we researched when looking through his diaries. Next. This is Alonso Alvarez de Pineda, and in 1519, he was one of the Spanish explorers who made his way, again, he was involved in seeing some of the Patagonian giants, but he made his way up to over to America, and they went up into the Gulf of Mexico and up the Mississippi River, and they saw settlements of villages inhabited by local giants, not far from where the river empties into the Gulf of Mexico. There he found a large town on both sides of its banks for a distance of 6 leagues up its course, so 40 native villages. And what's really interesting is he found not only a race of giants, also a race of pygmies, and they were living together and hanging out together, and he couldn't believe it. And so we have these stories of the big people and the little people in the same area. We find this in other parts of the world. It's one of these phenomena that Jim and I become very interested in. Next. Pineda, he actually, without realizing, when he sailed back around the Gulf Coast, he sailed past some huge Texas Indians, which were reported by other people. And he described them as being very tall and well-formed, with unusually coarse hair, and they were cannibals. So this is something we keep coming across as we go through North America's stories. Next. So this is just a highlight of this, which kind of made me very interesting, because some of the Spanish explorers went over to the Caribbean, and this this blew my mind when I read this. This was written by historian Peter Martyr. And it was told by a native who was Christianized and taken to Spain. And I'll just read this to you because it's so funny, so interesting. The report ran that the natives were white and their king and queen giant, whose bones, while babies, had been softened with an ointment of strange herbs, then kneaded and stretched like wax by masters of the art, leaving the poor objects of their magic half dead, until after repeated manipulations they finally attained their great size. So if that's how giants become giants, that is quite amazing. Next. We have more Spanish explorers. We have a whole chapter in the book called Early Explorers, where we talk about all the different eyewitness accounts of live giants in North America, and we talk about Patagonia as well. Too many to mention here, but this just shows you a map of where the explorers traveled to. We have De Soto, Hernan de Soto, Coronado, Cabeza de Vaca, and all of them witnessed live giants. And actually, De Soto got into battles with giants that became this crazy long story about Tuscaloosa and a great war that happened. And Tuscaloosa and his son were over 8 feet tall, and this is recorded on the historical record, and we feature this in detail in the book. Next. Even Captain John Smith in the early 1600s talked about, when he was mapping Virginia and the area, he talks about giants that he witnessed. They measured, I quote, they measured the calf of the largest man's leg and found 3/4 of a yard about. The rest of his limbs were in proportions so that he seemed as tallest and most goodly personage they had ever beheld. His arrows were 5/4 long, which means much bigger, headed with the splinters of white crystal-like stone. And they just basically were describing giants. If you look at this gentleman on the top right here, the text underneath it saying this is giant-like. So you can it's actually described as a giant of the gentleman he was describing. Such Gowanocks are a giant people and thus attired, it reads. Next. And here we have a map. If we jump over to New England, this just shows you, this is obviously somewhere where Jim lives up here in Massachusetts. This just shows you where the tribal boundaries around the 1600s of this area. But many of these were giants, even on Martha's Vineyard there. Next. And these skulls mark where we found giant skeletons have been reported. All over the place, right near Jim himself in Deerfield, up on the top left there. He lives in a place called Ashfield, very close to there. And even in his local museum, he found evidence of an 8-foot giant, what once existed there. All over New England, something I've been passionate about. I've been researching the hundreds of megalithic sites that are in New England. And of course, giants are being found there too. Next. This is the small island off the southeast coast. This is from Martha's Vineyard. And this dolmen here was overlooking the ocean in a town called Chilmar, close to where a giant was discovered. And so these dolmens are always associated with the giants. Next. We have another hanging rock here. It's called Phaeton Rock or Cannon Rock. And again, just not far from here, at a place called Fish Marsh, another 8-foot giant was discovered. And this is a carefully placed boulder. This is not by chance. There's 3 stones here. You can't really see them because they put wood around it to stop them falling on the house below. But we visited here a couple of years ago, and it's for real. It's a very interesting site. Next. This is Passaconaway. He was a Bashaba. He's like basically a chief of chiefs of the Pennacook tribe. And he was basically based around, between Massachusetts, New Hampshire, that kind of area. And he was a magician. He was like a priest. He was also a shaman and a sorcerer. And he had incredible powers, which we go into great detail in the book. He was said to be almost 8 feet tall. So this, I believe, and he was alive in the 1600s, and he lived to over 100 years old. This is something we find with many of these accounts, and even in the Bible, that they had a very, very long lifespan, extremely long. And just next to where he was found, we find a stone circle. Now this is right on the edge of their reservation, a place called Lowell in Massachusetts. It was recorded in 1659 as being there. So we know it's ancient, we know it's old, at least that old, and it could well have been built by the giant chief Pascoe. Who knows? We visited this site. There's also a burial chamber near here as well, called the Beehive Chamber next, which you can see in this image here. And so this does suggest that megalithic construction was taking place with these tribes, with these giant leaders. Next. So again, we're just having a quick look at the map here. We're going to jump down to Connecticut now, on the bottom left there. Next. We have this account. This is from the prestigious Peabody Museum in New Haven, Connecticut. Interestingly, that's where the Skull and Bones Society was formed. So I wonder if that's got anything to do with the giant skulls and bones they were finding. Again, this on a smaller scale, 6 feet 8 inches tall here, but some unusual artifacts were found with an unrecognizable type of metal. Next. This is in Hartford, Connecticut, just up the Connecticut River. They all seem to be located around major riverways. This is from 1901. Curious copper and stone implements and crude ornaments. The thigh bone of the giant skeleton is twice as large as that of an ordinary man. So we're talking 10 to 12 feet tall here. But we know accounts have been found all along the Connecticut River in a place called Gill, Northfield, Deerfield, Hadley, Montague, and so on and so forth. So we know even in New England, I mean, none of this has been reported until Jim put his research cap on and found that his local area had these giants. Next. This is a petrified giant, which was dug up in 1897. 8 feet long. Italian labourers dug this up and they could not believe what they found. Here's actually an illustration of it. And so even in New Haven, another one in New Haven, Connecticut, we do find this. So next, there's also some research done at Rockingham, Vermont. And I was going to show you another clip from the Search for the Lost Giants TV show, an investor show that. So next. So this just shows you... we did some Photoshop on this just to bring out the image a bit tighter because the one on the TV show didn't come out that well. But look, if you look here, they got some. Not only do they have antennas, that's a whole other story, ancient aliens, whatever you want to call it. But the one on the bottom right here kind of grabbed our attention because this is clearly larger than the others. And look what it's sort of representing with the teeth. It's a very strange look. So we think this could be representing the actual description we have of the skeleton or the skull, which shows extra rows of teeth, which is something we're going to get into shortly. But you look at some other ones here, they look like horns. Now, it gets weirder, honestly. We do a whole segment in the book about horned skull giants. And it's very strange, but this is real. There's some real discoveries here. There's ones that have got tails. There's, I mentioned the pygmies already, pygmies living with the giants. There's other ones with such outrageously large jaws, often even 3 rows of teeth in one account from the Smithsonian. So it gets crazy. We'll talk about that shortly. Next. So if we just shift over, I'm just going to do a quick scan across a couple of parts of America, looking at a couple of accounts. We've moved slightly west, going into New York State and Pennsylvania. New York State goes a lot further west than most people realize. Next. Here's a place called Onondaga Park in Syracuse. 28-pound weight sledgehammers were discovered here. Now, 9 pounds is the maximum you can use now as a sledgehammer. Large swords were found, and there's evidence of a great battle that took place in this area. Next. In 1849, this area as well is from the diary of Victor Hopkins Clark, and he talks about an area called the Salt Springs Reservation, where it was divided up in 1794. A feud ensued, and the superbly named Handsome Harry was the last native to fall. He was the And basically, what they found was several skeletons were found, one of extraordinary size. The skull was comparatively large, and the jaws surrounded with a full set of double teeth all around. They were perfectly sound, covered with beautiful enamel and the most perfect whiteness. Now, this is a clear description of double rows of teeth in both jaws, something that's caused massive controversy. We've actually got anthropologists and academics and Jason Colavito, skeptics, and all this stuff really attacking us over this, claiming, oh no, they're just describing single sets of teeth. That's just what they called them then. And we're like, really? So this is one of the genetic traits of the giants. We have more examples here from this area. We're going to get into the double rows of teeth thing very soon. We'll get into more detail about that. But this account has an immense, not only was he of immense size, he was furnished with a double row of teeth in both jaws. This is from Jefferson County in New York. Next. Oh, sorry, this one. Sorry, I forgot to say next. This one was the Jefferson County one I was just talking about, with a man of colossal size with double rows of teeth and various other found in that area. But often, as you can see in the bottom part here, so great has been the length of time since these bones have been covered. They fell to pieces very soon after being exposed to the air. And this is something that keeps happening. Whether this is an excuse and it's a hoax, we don't know, but this does happen with very ancient remains. So these could be much older than people realize. Next. Again, from the same book, under the roots of a large maple tree was dug up the bones of a man of great stature and furnished with entire rows of double teeth yet again. Next. And we have this account as well. This actually was a gentleman who witnessed some giant skeletons being dug up when he was a child in 1876. And he remembered that he took the measurements, and created these wooden structures of these giants when he was an older man, just to sort of emphasize what was going on in this area. And we talked to the the granddaughter of this gentleman, who verified the account. So again, another interesting lead. Next. Yeah, again, New York, Pennsylvania. We're gonna spread out now. Go next. And again, we're just jumping back to this. I want to show you again. We're going to move into the busy area now, Ohio and West Virginia, that kind of area. Okay, there's a wonderful Ross Hamilton. I just wanted to credit him. So next, oh yeah, we've got it there. That's fine. This is the Ohio area, and this is where most of the accounts come from. This is like we have so many accounts. We have like something like 200 accounts from Ohio itself, and we only have 250 total in the book. Spread out across the country. So this is the hub. This is the area. This area, and then slightly to the right of there, we have West Virginia as well. But let's look at Serpent Mound to start with. This is the most famous earthwork in the country. This is the most famous site in the country, really. This is it's 1,370 feet long. It's located near a town called Peebles. It's also on the edge of this great meteor impact crater. So you get these gravitational, magnetic, and other energetic phenomena happening there. Earth lights happen there, etc., etc. Now, just this mound, you can't really see it here, just at the very bottom of the tail, a bit further below, right on the bottom edge of the screen, is where some large skeletons were uncovered, including the one in the next slide. Next. And this shows you a 7-foot skeleton that was uncovered. This was on a postcard of all things, and my good friend and researcher Jeffrey Wilson managed to get a copy of this. And and actually the original, what we thought is that it was 7 foot as we see now. It's been cut off at the knees. I don't know why they do that, the archaeologists. But you can see this type of skull. It's a very powerful jaw, rounded skull. It's not classic Native American looking. This is something we'll explore as we get further into the talk. But this is a 7-foot example found at Serpent Mound. There are other examples, but Professor Putnam really was cagey about calling them giants. It wasn't a good thing back then. Academia, the Smithsonian, there were agendas in place, and they were covering up the giants. We'll explain why very soon. Next. If we head slightly further southwest from there, we find Marietta earthworks. These are a beautiful complex of mounds with moats, and also some very square earthwork stretching around a very large area, up to 1,500 feet wide. Step pyramids made of earth as well, very similar to what we find in Mexico. Next. Here's a photo of me looking daft from a trip there a couple of years ago. this is Marietta. Now, this is actually, strangely, they built a graveyard around this burial mound, which is something they tend to do. Next. This just shows you a plan of the whole site, and you can see the mound on the bottom right there heading out into the large square enclosures. And in the larger enclosure, you can see what looks like mini pyramids with steps going up. So this is something that has caused much controversy. But in 1901, in the Fostoria Review, in July the 25th, a taller than average skeleton was discovered within the earthworks. The bones were remarkably well preserved, are of abnormal size, and I was close to be reckoned. The individual must have measured at least 7 feet in height. So again, another mound builder giant. Next. This is an interesting one. This is something we just found just before we published the book. We just did a bit of research on this. But this is actually in Kentucky from 1903, and it was 60 feet below ground under a mound. So this is something that I've been questioning for a while, is the fact that before they build the mounds, they create a huge burial chamber deep within the earth, and then they build the mound on top. So it's an extremely large structure if you go in from the bottom to the top, much like the underground areas of the pyramids of Giza, I guess. But the strange thing about this one, they found a jar buried with this 8-foot giant that had some corn nibs in it that had been preserved. And so when they dug it out, they did a kind of antiquarian excavation on it and so forth. They planted the corn, and got an incredible yield from it. And it was a type of corn they'd never known before. So the mound builders knew about agriculture. However old this was, we don't know. But an 8.5-foot giant having this kind of sophistication does open up a lot of questions that have not been addressed by American academia. Next. West Virginia and Virginia, all the way over to the coast there. This is quite a hub of sites as well. Next. This is the famous Grave Creek Mound in Moundsville, West Virginia. Not dissimilar to Silbury Hill, a bit shorter than Silbury Hill, but in 1838, some excavations took place that yielded 2 large skeletons. The female was wearing copper arm rings with ornaments, said to be 7'4" taller than an 8-foot tall male, plus the mention of a great jawbone discovered there as well. Next. But also they discovered on the bottom right there this Grave Creek tablet. Now this has caused massive controversy. This is like, double the width of your thumb. It's tiny. It's a tiny little thing. They have a copy in the museum. There's also a copy in the Smithsonian. And when this was investigated, they realized it was like Semitic script or potentially Phoenician, Punic. Basically, it could have come from the Bible land. Could be part of the Canaanite tradition of the Nephilim and so forth. So this has really got people going. And it's disappeared now. It's gone missing, of course. All the good stuff does. But it's one of those mysteries that has never been answered. Next. This is an actual giant that's on display, which I haven't got my own photograph isn't as good as this one. Oh, no, that is my photograph on the right. I'm sorry, yes. I'm looking at the wrong slide. That is my photograph on the right. I've made it black and white because it looks a bit cooler like that. But the one on the left shows you the height of it. This is actually in the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, 7'6" from northern Kentucky. And I looked into this. I looked at the original records of this. It may well have acromegaly because it looks like it's got a sort of expanded chest area. But the jawbone and the eye sockets are very similar to what we find in the mound builders style spec, really. But the weird thing about this one is the fact that in the records it states that whoever displays this and purchases this must not reveal its origins. So I found that really interesting. So I bet this came from a mound. Next. If we head further into the Midwest, into the southwest, not quite in the southwest area yet, but Arkansas, Oklahoma next. We have various accounts here. This is at Chickasaw Mound. I visited here a few months ago. Many different things, many artifacts and bones. This was like open season, this place, from 1870 onwards. Gigantic stature and Herculean strength, which some described. There was even a skeleton that's left on display, just left in the corner of this tent that went missing after a few months. They didn't know what to do with it. It was so big. Next, this just shows you the mound, what it looks like today. It's a 13-acre site. But even, relatively recently, some giant skeletons were found when they were digging basements to build houses in the area. So I went up here. I tried to talk to some locals, but unfortunately it wasn't the best time because it was one of the holidays there in America. Next. That's it. So this is interesting. This is just up in the northwest of Arkansas, going over into Oklahoma. This is the Ozark Cave. We actually feature this in the TV show as well, but when they dug into these caves, they found skulls, and these are the photos of what must have been humans that were 10 feet tall. And this was published in a Rosicrucian publication. So we have the Masons, we have the Rosicrucians, we have the mystics all involved in this phenomenon from a very early date. This was 1913. Next. In the TV show, Search for the Lost Giants, Jim and his brother Bill investigated this account. They actually went diving into the flooded Beaver Lake. That was flooded in 1960 to 66. But they tried to find these caves that in 1913 were obviously not flooded. And so what they did find, though, was these sort of megalithic blocks and walls making up the entrance to the cave. So, again, more evidence linking giants with rather large stones. Next. And this just gives you an account of what was found there. At the depth of more than 3 feet, you found the remains of several giant human skeletons, including an almost perfect skull, which differed in many particulars from a modern specimen. When partly joined, the largest skeleton was almost 10 feet tall, and rigging showed us hieroglyphs covering the palisades thought to be 1,000 years old. So there were hieroglyphs down here as well. Next. Oklahoma, I'm just throwing some examples in here. It's a very interesting site here next called Spiro Mound. Or the main mound there is called Craig Mound. It's a series of what looks like 4 mounds joined together. I visited here again a few months ago, had a good look round. No evidence of giants now. They've all been taken away. But a Pensacola miner company were employed to dig it. And they were digging it for relics, basically. Next. And it just shows you them, proudly destroying the mound. But numerous skeletons and skulls were found here. Next. Among the treasured finds is a large femur, indicating its owner must have been about 9 feet tall. Bones and skeletons of other human beings are of normal size. And this is interesting. This is something that we do find over and over again, is that the giant shaman or the tribal leader is buried with his people, with his helpers, with his family or whatever, but he is the giant. There's always an elite group of these giants. This is something we find over and over again, and this is also mentioned in the legends. Next. He was over 7 feet tall. His jaw would fit around my face. He was more or less in pieces. We had to put him together. You see, he was bound to be a giant. Next. Here's just some of the artifacts, beautiful artifacts that were found within the burial. And speaking of artifacts, this is some giant axe heads that we got access to thanks to our good friend who's standing with me there, Brock Smith. One of them's 33 pounds, another one is 14.5 pounds. The average is 9 pounds, the heaviest a human can yield. These were found in a mound in, Illinois, and we got access to these. We got photos of them. We did some experiments with them, and you have to be a big, strong giant to wield something like that. That's for sure. This is one we mentioned in the book next. Sorry, I've just one behind there. What you see now is what I just described, the 33 pound and 14.5 pound axe heads. Next. This is the one that we feature in the book. Again, this is a 33 pound, 10 ounce axe. This was found in Missouri. Next. And now we're going to jump over and have a quick look at the Smithsonian. Now, this is a big problem because many of the bones, many of the giant skeletons were reported to the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian took them away. There's even accounts, next, of giants being found by the Smithsonian themselves. But generally what we find is that ones that were collected by the Smithsonian disappeared, and they're never to be heard of again. Even people who had got them taken away, they wrote to the Smithsonian, "Oh, we don't know what you're talking about," even though they collect them officially. Next. This just shows you just a few more examples of what we're dealing with here, where the Smithsonian came in and took them away. And there was an agenda forming at the time called Manifest Destiny, where it was similar to what happened in Australia, I guess, where they classed the Native Americans as savages so they could take over their land and didn't want them to seem smart in any way. But when they kept finding 36-inch circumference skulls, geometric earthworks, and giant skeletons with amazing armor and art and things like this, they realized they had to cover that side of things up to enable everyone to believe these Native Americans were savages, and therefore they could dominate them, put them on reservations, and steal their land. There's a lot more to it than that. We have the whole story in the Smithsonian Files chapter in the book. But this gentleman here next, called Ailes Hrdlicka, became the main curator of physical anthropology at the Smithsonian in 1910. And he was involved in the eugenics movement, pre-Nazi, this, that, and the other. And he became a real problem. And he covered everything up, denying giants even existed. Although, in the Smithsonian annual reports, we have 17 accounts written by their own professors. Next. This is just a quick description of what I just mentioned. This is the problem we find with manifest destiny, but also the theory of evolution was coming in at the time. And to find giant skulls and giant skeletons, it didn't fit in with the theory of evolution. It didn't fit in with manifest destiny. Therefore, it was deleted from history. Next. Yet more accounts of giant skeletons and the Smithsonian involvement. Next. There's Jim with the great Smithsonian annual reports that we went through piece by piece for the book. And also thanks to Andrew Collins and Greg Little, they helped us do the research on this. Next, double rows of teeth. These were reported by the Smithsonian. They've been reported all across the country. This is one of the most strange phenomena we find relating to the giants. Utterly weird. We cannot understand it, but we do have it today. We have the supernumerary teeth phenomenon. We have extra teeth. And so on and so forth. The one on the right's a reconstruction we did for the TV show. We have a whole chapter devoted to this, double rows of teeth. Next. And this just shows you some examples where they're describing 2 rows of teeth in the front and the back jaw, the top and the lower jaw. Next. Here we have like one of the skulls had 2 rows of teeth. Next. And we even find horn skulls, and this, unfortunately, we think is a fake, but we have several horn skull accounts throughout the Americas. This was supposed to have been found in 1916 in Pennsylvania. But what we do find, not only do we get double rows of teeth, we have horn skulls, but we have very elongated skulls. And all these skulls, the illustrations, next, are from northwest of North America. The bottom left there is actually from from Bolivia, a place called Pumapunku, which is a famous megalithic site. That actually got stolen, that skull. That was on display. It was found recently, the one on the bottom left, and it got stolen just recently. Luckily, we managed to see it before it got stolen. But the ones on the other ones are from North America, and these are the Flathead and the Chinook Indians. Next. We find similar skulls on the California Channel Islands. We find double rows of teeth here as well. This is one of the hubs of the giants. Hundreds of discoveries have been found here, and the dating of this area goes back 40,000 years of human occupation. The story is very controversial with amateur archaeologist Ralph Glidden, but in 1913, a German naturalist got the story going with the first giant skeleton discovery on the island. Next. Here just shows you the ones we feature in the book in this part of California. Next. And this is Dr. A.W. Firstenen, and he found an 8-foot-tall skeleton back in 1913. This was later researched by amateur archaeologist Ralph Glidden, and he collected a total of 3,781 skeletons on the Channel Islands between 1919 and 1930. He worked for the Hay Foundation in New York and claimed skeletons ranging between 7 feet and 9'2". On the top right there, we have Jim and Bill Vieira going to the island and looking through the records to see what else we could find there. Next. And this just shows you an image of a crouched skeleton with an elongated skull. This was in the records on that island. Next. And these are further skeletons of giant stature with elongated skulls that were found on Catalina Island that were photographed live by Jim and Bill for the TV show, for the book. Next. Here's some research done by a gentleman called L.A. Mazzulli, and he's kind of done some analysis on some of the photos found that Jim and Bill looked at, and found that he believes the skeleton on the bottom there must be 8'6" tall. Next. So Nicholas Island, we find yet more examples. Some were almost giants. The jaw or the skulls could fit over the head of an ordinary man. Next. Skulls with double rows of teeth, great caves. Again, this is in one of the Channel Islands or various Channel Islands. Next. We even have photos here from 1959 on Santa Barbara Island from 7,070 years. No, sorry, Santa Rosa Island. And this is a gentleman called Phil Orr. And they found some extremely ancient remains here, going 10 to 14,000 years old. Next. And even if we jump over into Nevada, California, and Utah, and we head further south, we find yet more examples. Next. Lovelock Cave in Nevada, the redhead, cannibal giants. We do a whole segment in the book about this. Go back at least 6,000 years. They used to terrorize the locals, and eventually, at least to eat the locals, they were cannibals. And eventually the Paiute tribe defeated them by burning them in their cave. Next. This just shows you some of the skulls that were found in the area, showing their robustness and power. Next. And if we just head south, we're just going to finish up in a moment. Just want to give you a quick outline, just a couple of minutes of what we're looking at here and where these people may have come from. We find giant skeletons down in Sonora, but also recently, these were discovered by various people in the 1930s, but more recently, these elongated skulls were found in a very close area to where the giants were discovered. So we're finding a mix between the elongated skull people and the giants starting to come together. This is something that we see in Australia, we've seen around the world, and we think it's partly a genetic trait. You do get elongated type skulls, but also this tradition of the elites and the shamans and the priesthoods to maintain through their generation as they noticed as such. Where they come from is a whole different matter. This is something we can't go into too much now, but we cover it in detail in the book next. The origins of the tall ones has been under scrutiny for a very long time. We look at the Denisovans, who came from Siberia, because the teeth they found, you can see on the left here, were twice the chewing surface of a normal human being. They had a very large finger bone that was found. On the top right there, we have the Homo heidelbergensis from South Africa and Europe, which were potentially twice the size of humans. These go back at least 100,000 years. And on the bottom right there, we have Cro-Magnon man, who was the forerunner in Europe of the Europeans. But it's now thought, and through the research we've been doing, and various other research like Dr. Goodman and so forth, that the Cro-Magnon man may have been in existence in North America before it was in Europe. So they could have originated in America, or could have been part of a whole migration happening through the Americas from Australasia. We've seen Cro-Magnon skulls earlier in Australia going back, 13,000 years, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of debate about this at the moment, which we analyse as thoroughly as we can in the book. Next, this just shows you the movement from the red to the yellow to the green of the Denisovans, from the Homo heidelbergensis, who were actually forerunners of the Denisovans and the Neanderthals. The Denisovans then came down and came through Asia and Australasia, probably made their way over to America as DNA has been found in North American tribes. So we know there's a connection here. We know the Denisovans were much larger than normal, potentially. This just shows you the tooth size we're dealing with here. A normal tooth and a Denisovan tooth. So there's something going on here. And Andrew Collins did some brilliant research on this as well. This just shows you a close-up. Next. This just shows you a close-up of the Homo heidelbergensis thigh bone, fossilized, analyzed by Professor Francis Thackeray at the University of South Africa. Claimed they were 7 foot tall. There's an archaeologist called Lee Berger who claims they're 7 feet tall. But this, we got on camera, Michael Tellinger filmed this guy, Francis Thackeray, claiming this was twice the size of a normal human being. So they could have been 10 to 12 feet tall. And these were the forerunners, the Denisovans, whose DNA ended up in North America. So there could easily be connections there. Next. This shows you a close-up of how tall Cro-Magnon man used to get. He used to be routinely over 7 feet tall. Next. And we know that the megafauna lived at the same time as the giants, and they died off 12,000 years ago. We know this because many of the legends state this, and there is archaeological evidence now coming out, putting humans on the map in North America at that time. Next. And these Native American traditions were collected by the wonderful Vine Deloria Jr., who died 10 years ago, unfortunately. He was the mentor of Ross Hamilton and has become an absolute mentor to us. He's a brilliant man, and he worked with all the Native American elders and collected the stories, and many of them talk about giants in a matter-of-fact kind of way. Next. And even Edgar Cayce, which is coming to a close here, great mystic. I'm sure many of you know who he is. Talked about giants from Atlantis. He talked about the mound builders of America. And he wrote that there were many different sizes and types of humans, from midgets to giants, as we saw already. There were giants in the earth in those days, men as tall, 10 or 12 feet in stature, and well proportioned throughout, which is something we find in the North American giants. They're well proportioned, and they're not got acromegaly, they're not got gigantism or anything like that. They're natural humans who have just got these genetic positives which we don't have anymore. And so this is something that needs to be looked at. Also, the mystic Rudolf Steiner talked about giants as well, as did Helena Blavatsky and various other mystics. And this is something that Jim is very interested in, and it gives another dimension to where these giants could have really come from. Was it Atlantis? Was it Lemuria? Is it lost land masses? Or is it even something more mysterious? But we get into this in the final chapter, and we take a look at the migrations, the possibilities, the origins, really far out theories as well. We don't mention aliens too much, but they probably should get a mention. But overall, you can't really take it all too seriously. Next. And this is just me and my co-author, Jim Vieira, in his giant office in Asheville, Massachusetts. And thanks very much for your time, everybody. And we hope you can grab our book or come and join us on one of our giant hunting and megalithic tours next. Thanks.
So, wow, that was an amazing video, that last one, particularly with all the information, and quite interesting to see that King Arthur was not only not legendary, but he was actually a giant, and his men that were with him were also very large, and so that sort of would add something spectacular to the story. Now, next week we're going to do more on giants. We're going to then push forward once you've truly accepted that giants did exist, and that the biblical narrative is likely to be very true about the angels or the watchers and the women and their offspring of giants, because we're going to study what they did in the ancient world according to the Bible text and also the books that are attached to the Bible text, like the book of Enoch. And we're going to then see how they affected the world of Noah, and try to learn from that about how what that is saying to us about the world that we now live in, coming into the second coming of Christ. Because Jesus did tell us that, and maybe it was a hint of some sort, that as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. So we're going to look at it not from the point of view of that it will be an unexpected coming of the Son of Man, an unexpected flood, but also that there are features of that world that are reflected even in our own world. So until next week, I hope you had a great time tonight and learned an awful lot of stuff. And there's lots more to learn again next week. I hope I'll see you there again. Until then, God bless and take care. Bye-bye.